Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here, and I want to really thank Samantha and Kelly for inviting me to this very exciting event. So this is really a very important topic, and I have to say the young generation is really drawn to this topic more than others, because this is really where the action has happened until now. So I have a couple of questions to get us started, and then I'll open the floor. Since this is a training, Matt, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the global stockpile of fissile material. If you can actually give us a sense of the urgency and the crisis we are facing. So the International Panel on Fissile Material, which actually you are a prominent member of, estimated that as of January 2017, we have 125 tons of enriched uranium, which is the equivalent of 76,000.
Split the digit, I think it's over 1,000.
125 tons.
Where? I mean, the Russians alone have more than that.
That's the, all right, well, that's the, which is the equivalent of 76,000 nuclear weapons. That's right. So.
I have this on a slide. Go ahead.
Well, the key question is, how did we get there? And could you give us a sense of where is this fissile material stored? How is it safeguarded? What are some of the options that we have for fissile material governance?
Let me just pull up the stuff. Well, so there are immense stockpiles of both highly enriched uranium and plutonium in the world. And they were incredibly widely distributed. As Corey mentioned, we've been remarkably successful in convincing countries that didn't really need the highly enriched uranium or plutonium on their soil to get rid of it. It's now the case that more than half of all the countries that ever had nuclear bomb material on their soil have agreed to get rid of it. So we've cut, at least in the sense of number of countries, the problem by more than half. Now, part of what was going on was, for decades of the nuclear age, people didn't really worry about the nuclear terrorism problem in a serious way. So in the 1960s, for example, by the end of the 1960s, the United States was exporting more than a ton of highly enriched uranium, so enough for dozens of nuclear weapons, every year to over 40 different countries, with absolutely no requirement that there be any security for it at all. And finally, in the early 70s, the Germans, of all people, made the mistake of asking for a ton of highly enriched uranium all at once, which provoked Henry Kissinger to scrawl on a memo, "Shouldn't we have a policy?" Which then provoked an interagency discussion, which concluded that, in fact, we should have a policy, and part of the policy should be that we require that if we're going to give export some nuclear material to you, that you provide adequate security for it. So it took a long time internationally for ideas about nuclear security to evolve, and even in the last 10 or 15 years, as Corey was saying, things have really changed a lot. I mean, there are places that, when I got involved in this business, literally had gaping holes in the fences, no detector at all to set off an alarm if someone was carrying out plutonium in the briefcase, where now the plutonium and the highly enriched uranium is in a huge vault with a giant steel door, and to even get to the vault, you have to swipe your card and put in your PIN code, and there are guys with machine guns around, and it just warms the cockles in my heart. Because I know Corey and I were both involved in making that happen, as well as in getting rid of the nuclear material on a lot of sites. But it is still a huge problem with management of nuclear material in the world today, and especially on the plutonium side. There is now more plutonium in storage, already separated from spent fuel, so kind of ready to go in a certain sense for nuclear weapons, in the world's civilian stocks than there is in all the weapon stocks combined. And essentially all of that was produced by mistake. The idea was, we'll reprocess it and then we'll use it as fuel. And they reprocessed it and then didn't get around to using it as fuel. And now over 250 tons of separated plutonium, not for thousands of nuclear weapons, is sitting around in storage while countries try to figure out what to do.
Right.
How can they get rid of it?
So it's a fantastic question that is currently a $40 billion question in the United States.
Is this the Yucca Mountain?
Well, no, not yet. We want to eventually put it into a form that would make sense to put there. I actually directed a National Academy study on this subject. God, it's almost a quarter century ago now. What do we do with all the plutonium from dismantled nuclear weapons was the question then. And basically you can use it as fuel in nuclear reactors, mix it with uranium so that it's sort of the same level of enrichment in a nuclear sense as your low enriched uranium fuel is, and then use it in the same reactors. Or you can put it in some more secure form, say put it in ceramic or something, or mix it with high-level waste or something, and then just dispose of it as waste. In a Yucca Mountain, or right now the going proposal for the US government for its plutonium left over from dismantled weapons is to put it in another nuclear waste site in New Mexico called the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, after what's called dilute and dispose. So they want to dilute it with some magical, mostly classified material, which is literally referred to as stardust. I would say, refuse to say what it is. I'm amazed that New Mexicans have objected to the notion that we're relying on stuff that we don't know what it is for safety. But anyway, and then dispose of it in drums in the waste isolation.
Thank you. Now, my other question is for Corey. So many argue that the nuclear security regime, if you compare it to the non-proliferation regime and the nuclear safety regime, is incredibly scattered, it's very fragmented, and it's very weak. One of the reasons is because nuclear security somehow relies also on the culture of the country. And in fact, one of the buzzwords that Matt uses over and over is nuclear security culture. So there are many differences of what countries accept as risks in managing nuclear energy. And I'm wondering if you can give us a sense, from your perspective, how weak is actually the regime so far? And what would be some common denominator principles that I think all the countries could accept in order to make it stronger?
So I think this comes back to this issue that I mentioned in my remarks about the idea that nuclear security is still seen differently, in that it is still fundamentally seen as the purview of an individual state. And no country has, even with all of the strengthening of the discussion, the international engagement, no country has ever been willing to kind of supersede its authority to regulate nuclear security to anything bigger than itself, whether that's a treaty that has any sort of, kind of credible enforcement, or an international organization, or even a kind of a voluntary collaborative arrangement, such actually does exist on safety. All the nuclear power plants in the world are a part of an organization called the World Association of Nuclear Operators that tells it exactly what its safety requirements are to a certain extent, and they have to be accountable to it. And they actually have a, like a walk of shame at their annual dinner of any plant that hasn't, met its requirements, has to explain what it's going to do or what it had done to
And they
fix
actually
them.
come and inspect.
And they come and inspect, right? And so I think that everything on nuclear security is still kind of voluntary and collaborative, but advisory. So I think that the likelihood, and part of that does come because of culture. Some of it comes because there's a big difference between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. So you can imagine that, again, some of the countries that have the largest inventories of material have them in their military programs, and it's not likely that any of those countries are going to accept, kind of a universal inspectorate or something like that. And then the other thing is just cultural factors. Some countries, this is obviously an issue for us right now, some countries are more comfortable with armed individuals, some countries less. For some countries, anybody armed has to be a member of the military or special kind of paramilitary police organizations. Others, you can have private security have access to firearms. In some countries, the facilities are extremely remote. In some countries, they're right in the middle of urban areas. You have different issues which I find fascinating related to personnel reliability, including including those are the measures to kind of evaluate whether people could potentially become an insider. So some countries, mental health treatment is very differently perceived. Drug and alcohol testing, just in Canada, they have a very different civil liberties perception of drug and alcohol testing. It's considered intrusive and private, and it can't be imposed without cause. So there are all these.
That was true. My urine gets tested all the time.
So
So
my point in saying this is that I don't have a lot of hope that the answer is some big universal thing that imposes the strict requirement and has an accountability. But I do think we can do a lot more in building up the tools that we have. And so, for example, inspection is not a word that the International Atomic Energy Agency would use, but they do have international advisory missions where any country can invite them in to evaluate both their regulatory and their practical nuclear security infrastructure. I think that there should be a broader, if not requirement, commitment to that every country should have to have those advisory services, and that they have to be repeated every regular period of time. So I think there are things we can do to strengthen, but I'm not of the mind that there's a silver bullet kind of one law to rule them all in this one.
Just to do a little bit of basics, we'll be talking about the regime a bit tomorrow, but under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, almost every country on Earth is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, except for India, Pakistan, Israel, and South Sudan hasn't gotten around to it. They've had a few other things on their minds since becoming a country.
And we can argue with lawyers about North Korea.
Right. Right. North Korea was a member, pulled out. And under that treaty, the states that don't have nuclear weapons agree not to get them and to accept inspection. So the IAEA actually has a legal right to go and inspect for the non-proliferation stuff. That's not true for safety or for security. So when the IAEA comes and does a review of safety or security, it's because that state voluntarily invited them to come. And on safety, those invited missions are pretty common, and there's the industry level missions that you're sort of almost required to have that Corey mentioned. On security, there's nothing like that. And similarly on safety, when there is a sort of near miss, a problem, then they do a root causes analysis, lessons learned, and that gets distributed to all the other similar plants and so on. And there's nothing remotely resembling that on security. So a lot of the real incidents that have happened, people even managing security at nuclear facilities are totally unaware of. And so they sort of think the threat is a lot less than it actually is, because they don't hear about the incidents that are actually happening.
Fantastic. Questions? Yes.
Yeah, Professor, you mentioned India, Pakistan in just one line, and President Obama, during the last nuclear security summit, also this was a paragraph in his speech. Now, Pakistan has a policy of forward deployment of nuclear weapons. How does it compare with the deployment of nuclear arsenal around the world among other nuclear power states? And how vulnerable or more vulnerable those materials may have become because of that policy? And how much do we know about how those weapons are deployed, if at all, already there?
Great questions. Unfortunately, a lot of this takes place in secret, and Pakistan in particular is very secretive. It fears that, number one, that your country, India, would attack its nuclear weapons if it had half the chance. And number two, fears that the United States would seize its nuclear weapons if it had half the chance. And that has made it. The United States has been cooperating with Pakistan to try to improve security for the nuclear weapons and materials in Pakistan, but it makes it very difficult when, from their point of view, one of the biggest security problems is the country that's trying to cooperate with you. So, for example, they don't, unlike the Russia cooperation, where there were U.S. experts at practically every facility where Russian nuclear weapons are stored, the Pakistanis won't tell us where the nuclear weapons are or where the materials are or what have you. Pakistan in recent years, partly in response to things India was doing, has shifted, has begun deploying short-range tactical nuclear weapons, as was being referred to. In peacetime, these are stored, we believe, in sort of central locations, but the idea would be that in order to prevent an Indian thrust into Pakistan, you'd have to have them pretty close to the front. And that creates all sorts of issues in terms of securing the transports, in terms of potentially delegating the authority to use or launch these weapons, in terms of use them or lose them pressures if the weapons are about to get overrun by the other side's conventional forces. And so I would argue it increases the risk of nuclear war between India and Pakistan, and also increases the danger of seizure by non-state actors. Pakistani people say, no, we have the best security available, and we know that you, United States, made a lot of mistakes with your tactical nuclear weapons, but we've learned from that, and we won't do any of the stupid things that you do. We've had a lot of effort to have U.S. generals who are involved in tactical nuclear weapons explain to them, what an idiotic idea we realized it was. I have a colleague who's still alive who, during the Berlin crisis, was a captain in charge of a unit of nuclear artillery, and his orders were, if Soviet tanks appear through that gap over there, you're to use nuclear weapons on your own authority, at the level of a captain. It's amazing we survived.
I want to ask you guys a little bit about sort of some of the politics and diplomacy behind these efforts. So, like, we heard a lot, for instance, about how worsening relations with Russia have or haven't affected nuclear security cooperation. So, with Russia, but also with all the other countries who might participate in these kinds of summits, how much of it sort of depends on good relations and goodwill in other sort of political contexts, and how much of it is sort of more behind the scenes cooperation that's kind of ongoing despite the problematic ties that might be happening in other parts of the relationship?
You want to take it first, Karen?
Sure, I'll start. I think that as in everything, the cooperative kind of positive relationship is important to get real work done. And we certainly have seen that there has been a change, and Russia is the most obvious example, but not the only one, where countries have been more, over time, been either more willing or less willing to engage. Despite the South African Pelindaba incident that Matt talked about, South Africa has been one of the hardest countries to actually engage on nuclear security cooperation. At the same time, they have this residual material from their program, and they don't have a forward path for it. They don't have, and they have actually very helpfully converted their entire medical isotope production from using highly enriched uranium in both the reactor and in the target material. So they can't even say that that's their need for their highly enriched uranium anymore. So that's been a difficult one. I do think that one of the benefits of the practical nuclear security work is it tends to be technical, and it tends to be working level. So a lot of times the nuclear security cooperation that goes on between, for example, the U.S. Department of Energy or some elements of the Department of Defense, Defense Threat Reduction Agency in particular, that can kind of happen and kind of go under the wave tops of the general relationships. And one example I'll give is, Matt's right that almost all of the nuclear security cooperation, and particularly any of the exchanges of people on the ground in Russia, that's all ended. That had been kind of petering out, but it's definitely done, for now, given the relationship. But that's been a political decision, not a technical decision. And a lot of the technical relationships still stand. The technical folks in Russia and in the United States would like to continue to work together. They think there is collaborative work. After all, we have the two largest nuclear enterprises, so we have a lot to do together, a lot to share. But the political, winds are not allowing that to happen. One area where it does continue is in the removal of highly enriched uranium from third countries. So a lot of the material, as Matt said, was sent out around the world by the United States, but Russia did the same thing in their sphere. And they sent a lot of material out around the world. And there has been very good collaborative work between US, Russia, with the help of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and then whatever country has the material to do these removals. And that has continued consistently and without interruption through everything that we're talking about and continues now. So there are examples of successes, but it does remain a particularly difficult environment.
I do think working together actually builds trust, and so it can actually help overcome political difficulties in some cases when the technical people are actually, working together. And we definitely saw that in the 90s between the United States and Russia. If I could just put in a small advertisement for a nuclear threat initiative product, there's quite a good report that I was also very much involved with that NTI did with a Russian group, the Center for Energy and Security Studies, on opportunities for restarting cooperation between the United States and Russia, at least in small ways, in nuclear energy, nuclear security, nuclear safety, a number of areas. And I am, despite election hacking and the investigation and so on a regular basis and continuing to natter at various people in the government about, well, what if you tried this? What if you tried that? I still think there are opportunities to get that going despite the political wins.
I wanted to ask you, Matt, to give us your sense of what's this Saudi question that they want now to build these 2 nuclear reactors, and the U.S. It's 1, 2, 3 agreement,
Right.
should do the gold standard. The dilemma that the U.S. finds itself in on that score.
So I am in I think a minority of my non-proliferation community on this topic. I don't know whether Corey's in the same place I am or not. My view is it is very, very important to work to prevent the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technology to additional countries. As we heard from Kate, those are the key technologies that allow you to make nuclear bomb material. But I think asking countries to sign away their rights forever is among the least effective tools for accomplishing that objective. So if I were running policy at the moment, I would probably not insist on Saudi Arabia signing something like the UAE agreement where they signed away their enrichment and reprocessing rights, and I might push for some side note that said, we have no plans for the time being, and if we start thinking we're going to have plans, we'll talk to you. I think the much more effective thing to do, and actually Corey's been very much involved in this as well, is structuring incentives so that countries have no need for it. So recently, for example, a fuel bank was established under the auspices of the International Atomic Energy Agency with funding from the Nuclear Threat Initiative, so that if a country ever suffers an interruption in their supply of enriched uranium, they can draw on the fuel bank. And that gives countries more confidence in relying on the international market for their fuel. The reality is there are about 30 countries with nuclear power plants. The vast majority of them don't bother with their own enrichment. And so when a country like Iran says, oh, we have to have enrichment to run our reactor, it's like, well, South Korea has dozens of reactors. It doesn't have any enrichment. As I said, the vast majority of countries don't have enrichment or reprocessing. It's my hope to continue that as long as humanly possible.
Corey, do you want something?
Well, I'm hesitant because there's a whole panel tomorrow where I'm going to opine at length on the kind of connection between the civilian nuclear industry and the non-proliferation issues. But I will say that, Matt, you may be lonely, but you're not alone. I personally agree that there are other ways to achieve the same outcome, whether they're with shorter-term commitments or longer-term commitments. And I think the one thing that doesn't work is just arguing that they don't need it. And that's where I think we can talk about this a little bit tomorrow, because no country is actually bound to act logically.
That is certainly true. I would say, by the way, Saudi Arabia doesn't have the technology.
No.
None of the major suppliers are going to sell them the technology. And I would be concerned about the possibility that Pakistan might sell them the technology, given the huge assistance Saudi Arabia supplied to Pakistan's nuclear program. But we got a lot of leverage with both Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, so I'm hopeful that we will prevent that from happening.
How proactive has the Trump administration been so far on prioritizing nuclear security? Has it staffed up the people that it needs to? Has it been enforcing some of these treaties that or agreements that came out of the summits?
Honestly, I always feel bad about whining about where we are on nuclear security because it's in better shape than practically any other substantive policy area I can think of in the Trump administration. I mean, they have continued more or less the Obama approach, including some of the Obama people. Corey was until very recently serving in the Trump administration. And the woman in charge at the White House was in charge at the White House in the Obama administration and is a very capable professional.
Who's that?
Andrea Hall. And then the person who's just been confirmed to be head of the National Nuclear Security Administration, similarly, is a very capable professional, Lisa Gordon Haggerty, who was a senior White House official in the Clinton administration. So there are getting to be an increasing number of real professionals at fairly senior levels of the Trump administration. And on this particular topic, I would say they're in more or less the same place. Now, obviously, they don't have a president who's focused on it in the way Barack Obama was focused on it. But you wouldn't have expected that even if Hillary Clinton had become president. So I think the key issue now is figuring out how do we avoid sliding back when we're not meeting at the summit level anymore, when there's not that same intensity of very top-level political attention to the question. We have a report that we're working on now that'll be coming out in a couple of months, sort of assessing how things are going. And basically, our conclusion is that at the individual country level, countries are still making some noticeable improvements, but that the overall regime is not continuing to strengthen in the way that it was, and that even at the country level, the momentum is maybe slowing compared to where it was before.
My question is probably a historical one. I was wondering if you could talk about how deterrence theory developed, and then what confidence do we have that applies to different parts of the world? It was mostly developed in the context of Soviet Union and the U.S., but like, for example, between India and Pakistan, do we feel confident that it applies to a large degree to that? And then right now in Washington, why are there some loud voices thinking, well, it shouldn't apply to North Korea?
Right. Great question. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do it justice. I'll give it a shot, and Corey can correct me.
Well, I know I can't do it justice. Please.
So I would make a distinction between the sort of elaborate constructs of deterrence theory developed in places like the Rand Corporation and so on, and the sort of basic intuitions. I would prefer not to have my country turned into a sea of radioactive glass, and that guy could do that to me if I do anything bad to him. That's sort of basic, and I think that works quite well. The United States and the Soviet Union each spent a lot of effort trying to make sure that they didn't get into a nuclear war. I am, for better or for worse, North Korea has had nuclear weapons for over a decade now. They have had the ability to attack Seoul. They've had the ability to attack probably Tokyo. To me, it's a little bit strange for the United States to be saying to its allies, oh, it's okay for them to be able to nuke you, but for them to be able to nuke us is totally unacceptable. I believe that history shows since 1953 that the North Korean regime is aggressive and irascible, but very careful about protecting its own power, and that they know perfectly well that we have the ability to destroy them should they provoke us to do so. So I think they will not, I don't worry very much that Kim Jong-un is going to wake up tomorrow morning and say, boy, today would be a really great day to nuke San Francisco. What I worry about much more is inadvertent escalation of crises and provocations. The North Koreans carry out provocations every once in a while for a variety of domestic and international reasons. There is a plausible story that they may do so more. Once they have the ability to threaten the United States with nuclear weapons, which, by the way, they already have the ability to threaten the United States with nuclear weapons, because, any given ship that comes into San Francisco Bay or Los Angeles Harbor, how do we know it doesn't have a North Korean nuclear weapon on board it? And it's a Panamanian ship, it's not a North Korean ship, et cetera. So the notion that ballistic missiles are the only tool is, I think, an incorrect way of thinking about it. But you can easily imagine a provocation. South Korea is sick of just taking it all the time, and so they strike back in some way. North Korea sees that as escalatory strikes back using, for example, conventionally armed ballistic missiles. That leads us and the South Koreans to say, we better start taking out the missiles. Then the North Koreans say, well, I've got to use them or lose them, et cetera. So you can imagine a variety of scenarios that lead to escalation that nobody really intended when the crisis began.
Is that the main reason why people, like some policymakers in Washington, feel that they need to do a strike? Because if deterrence worked in the Cold War, why would it not work now? Like it's because they think that there's
I
a
will
bigger
say
chance.
that we have a whole session on the topic of nuclear dangers of states, including North Korea, tomorrow. I think that people think of the North Koreans as more irrational than I would argue history demonstrates that they are. I think the North Korean regime has done a fantastic job of maintaining power and is fairly cautious in their focus on maintaining power.
Could I add to this? So not to talk specifically about kind of the stability of deterrent relationships between states, but to bring it back on to nuclear security. I think one of the reasons we are so concerned about nuclear security and the potential for nuclear terrorism is because this is where all of these relationships break down, all of these theories break down, because you cannot deter an actor who has no regard for its own survivability, but more importantly, that their survivability is not tied to a territory or a national entity. And so if you have,
you don't know where to hit.
You don't know where to hit. You don't know who might have supported them along the way, and then you have to decide, is it proportionate to use a nuclear response to a nuclear action if the nuclear response is on maybe a country that provided harbor or allowed their banking system to be used, but they weren't really responsible for the nuclear the nuclear weapon being used. So is that suddenly proportionate, or is it kind of the U.S. theory of accessory? If you're an accessory, are you just as responsible as the primary actor? And so and then when you add cyber to this, it adds a whole other layer. So I had previewed at the end of my presentation that kind of one of the forward-thinking issues on nuclear security is the connection between cyber and physical security. And so let me just throw out, if you have the ability to interrupt the operation of a facility physically through a cyber means without ever being on site. What do I mean by that? If a nuclear power plant has a thing that toggles, this is an example that somebody who's done a lot of these investigations has described to me. It has a toggle, right? This little machine toggles, and it has to do that to regulate. It's a valve, and it regulates pressure or temperature or coolant or whatever it might be. And that toggle valve has a life of 10,000 toggles. And they know that every 10,000 toggles, they're going to go in, they're going to do a plant refresh, they're going to replace that valve. The problem is, if you have the ability to suddenly toggle that thing at 10 times its normal rate, it might not actually interrupt the operation of the plant. You might see no change in the temperature, you might see no change in the pressure, but now its life operation is cut by a factor of 5. That thing fails when you don't expect it. That's the kind of physical cyber security connection that we're concerned about. And then the other related is, people talk about this ability of, somebody to access a facility, and yet all of the systems around the core functions of plants are usually extremely well, managed and protected, but the auxiliary systems aren't. So if anybody had their data stolen in that Target data hack a few years ago, that hack went into the point of sale system through an air conditioning vendor. So if you think about, for a nuclear power plant, what's the equivalent? If you want to be able to get somebody inside the plant, you don't need to disrupt the security on that vault, but maybe you just need to get into the system that regulates the badges and get a new badge issued, or change the authority on somebody's badge where they're not supposed to get to that vital area, but now if they swipe at that door, now it allows them through. So these are the areas that are really interesting, and they get to this kind of who's complicit and who's responsible. And those are two very different issues with regard to retaliation.
Let me just do one line on India and Pakistan, because that was part of your question. So I think deterrence works in a similar way, but you have to remember, the United States and the Soviet Union were a continent apart from each other. India and Pakistan are right next to each other. They share a border, their border is disputed, there's some fairly intense hatred, and there are groups that conduct attacks that aren't fully controlled by either government. So you could have provocations that could then lead to escalation that neither government originally intended to have happen. And the doctrines on each side tend to be sort of escalatory. So India says, don't do a big terrorist attack against us, or we will do a conventional strike into Pakistan. Pakistan doesn't really know how big a terrorist attack would lead to an incursion. Pakistan, trying to deter that conventional incursion, says, don't do a conventional incursion or we'll use tactical nuclear weapons against it. And India says, trying to deter that use of nuclear weapons, says, don't use nuclear weapons or we'll use the full force of our strategic nuclear weapons. And so if everybody implemented their doctrines exactly as stated, you could end up escalating to nuclear war.
Could you talk a little bit about, on your point that you just made about cybersecurity, what are the trends and the patterns that you're seeing over the last several years in terms of attack vectors on nuclear plants and related facilities? Are we seeing vulnerabilities manifesting at, for the goals of data destruction, data exfiltration, command system? Basically, like, when, if ever, should we expect, the U.S. to discover on its own soil that someone else has made a Stuxnet and succeeded?
So
or is that kind of a more theoretical problem?
Right. I mean, I can't talk about specific attack vectors, but I will say just the overall kind of quantity, quality, pace, scope of incursions is up across all sectors, and I include the nuclear sector in that. And again, I'm by no means a cybersecurity expert, but what I'm paying attention to on this, it's real. There are questions, though, as to how much of that is or could be related to a nuclear pursuit versus a critical infrastructure pursuit. Because when you have nuclear power plants, you're right in the middle of that. So you could have somebody who's looking for an avenue because of the nuclear consequence and the other, but you could also just have somebody who's looking for an avenue to get at, major contributors to the grid as a whole, right? And so it doesn't matter if it's a nuclear plant, a gas plant, a coal plant, they're just trying to address the power infrastructure. So I'd say, we're particularly concerned about this because it is at the intersection of a lot of different areas, and because none of those areas have really focused on, in a kind of holistic way, on the overall kind of governance of cybersecurity for nuclear facilities.
Like, can you get specific at all about?
No.
Just.
Well, for example, in South Korea, there was a North Korean intrusion that was not on the control systems of the nuclear power plants, but was on other systems at the nuclear reactors, and I think was largely designed to cause embarrassment to the South Koreans. Most U.S. nuclear reactors have had some form of malware appear in their system somewhere, but It's important to remember that the actual control systems of nuclear power plants were built in the 70s mostly, 60s and 70s, and are mostly analog. So basically, can't be hacked in a digital way. Now, that's shifting over time, of course, and there's lots of other computers used for other things that are important, and as Corey was mentioning. So, but the actual thing that,